As I already mentioned, we are recording the event in order to publish it on our website afterwards. And I think that's it on housekeeping. And I would like to now introduce the panel to you. And let me start with Matthias Buck from Agora Energiewende and Ember. He's head of European energy policy. Good morning, Matthias. Then we have Fabian Hein, who's analyst at Agora Energiewende and Ember. Good morning, Fabian. We also have Dave Jones, analyst from our partner organization Ember, which used to be Sandbag in the past, in case you've already attended one of our webinars in the past. I think it's the 5th time actually that we are doing this report together. So welcome to you also, Dave. And there's also Grace Alster, also from Ember, who will also be joining the presentation. Good morning, Grace. Now, before I hand over to you four to start with the presentation, we of course have prepared another poll. The ones of you in the audience who already are with us on a webinar, not for the first time, know that we do like polls in order to learn a bit more about you as the audience. We are interested in finding out from where you are tuned in. If it's only from Germany and England, then we know we're good in marketing in these 2 countries, in our home countries, so to say, but what about the others? So we're really curious. Today, we are not using the Zoom poll, but Mentimeter. So you can already go to menti.com, and then we will give you the code where you can actually enter the country from where you're tuned in. In order to make it, it would be great if you could put in the name of the country in English and only with small letters, so that the same country actually is shown as one, because we will do one of these word clouds to see where most people are tuned in from, and also to see where maybe we got some people from Southeast Europe or Southern Europe, or maybe from the North. We will see. And I will do the sharing thing, and it's always a bit exciting when doing it with an external device. Okay. It's not going to take long. I'm almost there. Okay, and someone apparently already did. I think that was when we were testing it. Now, on your screen, you should now see the code that you're supposed to enter when accessing menti.com. It's 1145071, and then you are automatically on the side where you can put in the country from where you are tuned in now, where you're sitting now. And we see Germany is still at the front, followed by Austria and Belgium. Well, it keeps changing. Still Belgium in the 2nd place. Switzerland, England, France. I see someone from Turkey also. Denmark. Did I see Brazil? Yes, I see Brazil. Hungary, Greece, North Macedonia, Czech Republic, Italy, Sweden, Bulgaria. I see Austria and AT, so Austria maybe even a bit more bigger. Japan, wow. Romania. Slovenia also. Ukraine. And Spain. And now it looks, oh no, it's still moving. So, come on, it cannot be that difficult. Anything new that I haven't seen before? No, so, yeah, Germany keeps sitting in the midst. Followed by Austria and Belgium. Nothing's changing there. England, Switzerland are sort of on place 4 or 5. And then France, and then, but yeah, I think that is quite a good mix of Europeans and also people outside Europe, which is great, I think. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Scotland, fantastic. I could go on forever, but at the moment it looks like everyone who wanted to has put in the country. So thank you for that. And I will stop sharing the screen here. And we have one more poll, which is on the sector that you're working for. And let me open this again. Share my screen once more. And yeah, you can already put in the sector that you work for. Is it politics, including administration? Is it economy or science and consulting? Are you a student or working for an NGO or for others? Because obviously there's loads more. And we can all see you voting. The good thing about Menti is that everyone can actually see while you're voting, as opposed to the Zoom polls, where it's usually only me that I can see, and only when I share, everyone else can see the results. So that's the good thing about Menti, and actually I'm quite satisfied how it worked today. So we see that the economy sector is represented by most of the people in the audience who voted. We have people voting. But I think it doesn't change its number, but not really like the order. So we have a lot of economists apparently, followed by representatives from science and consulting. Maybe the people from the other sector can write me to webinar@agora-energiewende or into the chat which sector they are working for, and then maybe we can include those, because 18 is quite a lot. We have some 15 representatives from NGOs, followed by representatives from politics, including administration, and also 5 students. And with this picture from our audience from all over Europe and beyond, I will now hand over to Matthias, I believe, and wish you a good presentation. Enjoy.
Thank you, Nicola and Craig, and good morning to all. I hope you can see the presentation. So I go right into the slides. I think Fabian, you're flipping the slides. So before we report on the numbers that you find the report, we thought it would be helpful and interesting indeed to set a bit the context in which today's numbers are placed. Next slide, please. So you will be aware that EU heads of state and government last year in December, shortly before Christmas, decided to increase Europe's climate target, Europe's 2030 climate target, to 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030. If you look at where we're coming from, since 1990, it means that in the next 10 years, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by about as much as we did over the past 30 years. So it's a significant acceleration of climate action. Next slide, please. The number of studies we have done as Agora One for Germany, I'm here referring to the McKinsey Climate Neutral Europe scenario. A number of studies, now seriously, trying to understand what does climate neutrality mean by 2050 for Europe and in a national context. And all studies find that the power sector must decarbonize very quickly in order to move to a climate neutrality pathway. And this, of course, the focus of the report is the power sector. Next slide, please. Specifically, looking at the mix of electricity, where we are today and looking to 2030, so only a decade away, the most important changes are two. First, renewables will very significantly increase its share in the mix, and coal will almost be phased out completely by 2030. And the 2030 is the Commission 55 impact analysis, the mix scenario, so the main scenario they have been working on, identifying 68% renewables share and only 2% coal left in 2030. Next slide, please. Now, in order to get us there from a regulatory side, the Commission is currently working on a huge legislative package. The first big chunk of it will be presented in June, and it will address a second in the last quarter this year, and it will essentially update, revise all the important pieces of legislation across the different sectors of the economy to bring them in line with the 2030 climate target to make our legal framework 55% consistent. Again, it will also update legislation that is relevant for the power sector, most importantly, the European emissions trading system. So this is the context in which we're operating. So in that sense, the 2020 report is really assuring ourselves where do we stand at the beginning of this new decade that needs to bring down power sector emissions very quickly. Next slide, please. And I'm handing over to colleagues. Next slide.
Hi, everybody. I'm Grace, and I helped put together the most recent data that was used in the making of the report. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about how we did that before they get into the actual findings. But firstly, I'll just say that, as with all our reports, we try to be really open and transparent about our sources and how we do it. So I'm going to tell you about it today, but you can also find all of the data on the website, along with a much more detailed explanation of how we do it. So I'll just stick the link in the chat. So first about the sources, as you can see with the color coding, all German data comes from AG Energiebilanzen, while all other pre-2018 data comes from Eurostat. We consider both of those to be really reliable sources. They have a lot of expertise, and Eurostat is curated by the EU Commission itself. So we just use those figures as they come. However, the Eurostat figures are only available up to 2018, and obviously we want to talk about 2020. At Ember, we track electricity generation of EU countries on a monthly basis anyway for our own use. And we also publish it on our website. If you want to use it, it comes out on the second Monday of every month. And for that, our main source is ENTSO-E, who publish, it's a little bit hard to download if you're not too technical, but they publish everything hourly on their transparency platform. And if we notice any gaps, holes, or problems with that data, we supplement it with local TSOs. And we do that on a regular basis with the countries that you can see listed next to Germany. So Italy, Poland, Spain, Finland, and the Netherlands. Yes, there is an alarm, I'm sorry. And in addition, we sometimes make small estimates and tweaks to fill in gaps. In terms of the methodology, instead of just switching abruptly from Eurostat in 2018 to our data in 2019, which could cause a sort of artificial step change in the numbers, instead, we calculate the absolute year-on-year changes, as you can see on the slide, and then apply those to the 2018 Eurostat figures so that it creates a sort of smooth flow. And then we sort of cross-reference everything and check again with local TSO data. And that's all. I'll just finish up by saying that if you have any more questions or suggestions, you know, if you're sitting there thinking, well, why don't they use this source, which is wonderful, or why did they do it like this? Please, please, please email me about it. We're always looking for feedback on how we do it. So any suggestions are really, really welcome. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Grace. You gave us a heads up about the neighbours arguing next door, but we got the fire alarm instead. But that's good. So I want to go on to present the key findings from the report, and then at the end I'll hand over to Fabian, who'll talk a little bit about the COVID impact that had on the electricity sector throughout 2020. For reasons that will become clear as I go through this, the COVID impact was obviously a major feature of last year, but maybe not quite as big as you might expect it to have been. So this is our kind of landmark slide, I guess, from the report. The headline was "Renewables Overtakes Fossil Fuels," which is quite a landmark on Europe's electricity transition. And the reason that that's come about is twofold. Firstly, that wind and solar have been building up. So you can see underneath that, wind and solar have been providing that increase in renewables to the extent that wind and solar last year provided a fifth of Europe's electricity. And then as wind and solar have been built up and some other things going on in the mix that we'll talk about later, coal's been falling underneath that. So coal generation is now half the level of what it was in 2015. So in just 5 years, it's managed to halve across the whole of Europe, which is some achievement. And I just wanted to I guess reflect on a few of these things that we learned from, or we saw as we put this main slide out, and that got people talking over the last week. And the first thing is that the renewables overtake fossils is a really powerful line. Remember, it's electricity and not energy. There was all sorts of headlines that confuse electricity and energy together. So this is just in context of the electricity transition, which is obviously leading the broader energy transition, and which is why it's so important. The other thing that I want to mention is there were a lot of people that tweeted out this graphic, and one was from the Main Extinction Rebellion account, and they tweeted it out with quite a nice line of, "This isn't success, this means success is achievable." And to me, if I was to kind of summarize this report, that's quite a nice summary. It's not saying we're there by any means, but it's saying we're on the right pathway. It's a nice landmark moment. But it's by no means showing that we're close to where we need to be at all. And in terms of the coverage that kind of came from it, actually a lot of the coverage and a lot of the interest was from outside Europe, which was really exciting for us because we wanted to use this as a more of a kind of story of hope about how Europe's on this journey and quite a fairly advanced stage of this journey through the electricity transition. And it's nice to see now kind of other countries throughout the world picking up on that and excited for their own electricity transition, and I guess the kind of inspiration that's coming from Europe as that wind and solar is displacing coal so quickly. So if I go on to the next slide, and actually that same landmark moment of renewables overtakes fossils in the top left for EU happened also in Germany, that the top right slide, and that was the lead on Agora Energiewende's Germany report that came out at the start of January. It also happened in Spain. Spain's picture looks a lot more confusing. It's got a lot of hydro in the mix that varies from year to year, where fossil fills the gaps. But if you look at the dotted lines underneath that, you can see the trend. You've got wind and solar building up, and you've got coal being displaced. And Spain's story about phasing out coal is a really powerful story. You can see from that graphic alone that coal's been falling faster than wind and solar have been rising. So gas has been increasing within that mix, but that the wind and solar to coal is still a compelling part of the story. I've put the UK on here as well. It's obviously not in the European data, sadly. But the reason why UK also achieved this moment of renewables beating fossil in 2020 for the first time. But I guess the most interesting thing about the UK was you can see coal has been phasing out or near zero for the last few years. And we're at that next stage of the transition now, where as the more and more, especially wind, is coming online, it's now not offsetting coal, is now going to the next step of offsetting gas. So gas generation last year was at a 5-year low in the UK, and there's no other country that we've seen so far in Europe where wind and solar have got to the stage of displacing coal and is now at scale start displacing gas. We know that will come. and it's really encouraging to see the UK there. And the big question for the UK on policy this year is how quickly can the UK actually phase out fossil generation? And at the moment, we're hoping that we can put it in line with the US's commitment on 2035. So that's the big conversation that's happening in the UK at the moment. So this is the breakdown of renewables by technology. So when we talk about renewables, we talk about bioenergy, we talk about hydro, and then wind and solar. Other renewables, wave and geothermal, don't get much of a look in yet. You would hope they might grow, but so far very niche technologies. On the bioenergy side, the last 2 years really haven't seen any growth at a European level at all in terms of the electricity side. So where that growth had been happening is that growth has now leveled off or zeroed off. Netherlands have been picking up as it's burning a bit more. Other countries have been falling to net to zero. Hydro bounces up and down depending on how much it's raining in different places, but you can see broadly underneath that, virtually all that growth, especially in the last few years, has been coming just from wind and solar on the renewables side. So what we want to now do is unpack some of wind and solar by itself, because it is wind and solar that's powering that transition in Europe. So if we look firstly in terms of terawatt hours, this is the terawatt hours by country. You can see how important Germany in there is. You can see the percentage increase year on year. The three that I want to highlight that had the biggest percentage increase were Netherlands. Netherlands is undergoing a really rapid transformation with its wind and solar after quite a few years of sitting on its hands and not doing too much. Belgium likewise stepping up, and then Sweden 36% increase as well, as a whole load of wind plants came online, which is really encouraging. So you can see that slowly build up in terawatt hours. If we go on to the next slide, maybe a more useful metric of that, and if we zoom out a bit to a more kind of decadal view, is looking at it as a percentage of the electricity mix. And I really like this graphic because it gives a bit more of a long-term basis that you can understand. And if you look at where the grey line is for EU27, you can see that 20% of electricity that was provided for wind and solar for the whole of Europe. And you can also see the dots of the previous the decade as it was building up. And it's interesting that actually the second half of the decade didn't build up any faster than the first half of the decade. So we're not on that path of getting faster and faster year-on-year growth yet. And that's one thing that we'll talk about in a minute. But the other thing that I wanted to do was unpick some of the countries there. Firstly, where the growth was lower in the first half of the decade. So if you start at the bottom of Slovakia, Czech Republic, you see that they were building up in that first half of the decade, and in the second half of the decade, that growth has been really slow as they've kind of really reduced the amount of wind and solar that they're building to very low levels. And if you carry up the list, you see the same is true of Bulgaria, of Poland, of Romania, of Italy, and then also of Portugal, which had a very good story to the first half of the decade, and then has had very little growth in the second half. On the flip side, you can see it's interesting to see the countries that have been accelerating. So that if you start at the bottom again, you've got Hungary having really stepped up in the last 5 years. You've got France really step in there and embracing wind in particular at the moment. Hi Finland, welcome to the game. That's a really healthy pickup. And then you've got Netherlands, which is really cool. But even with all of that that's happening with the Netherlands, it's interesting to see that Netherlands is still just below the average, the mix in the EU. So although it has built up very quickly, the total levels are still relatively low. And just a final kind of reflection on this slide, I guess, is just like the absolute levels of are pretty huge where we got to now. If you take like the massive country of Germany, and you've got 33% just from wind and solar. If you imagine the hour by hour like variation in wind and solar underneath that, and how that's built up, it's really quite an impressive feat to be having that much electricity generation in the mix already, and quite an achievement that Europe's already achieved with this. Cool. If you go on to the next slide, this shows just how quickly wind and solar now need to pick up. So we've been talking about the historic part. If you look at that black dotted line, it's been increasing about 38 terawatt hours a year on average over the last decade. It was a bit quicker in 2020, 51 terawatt-hour increase, but it's not a substantial increase compared to where we need to be. So if you look at the EU impact assessment of how we get to 55%, and Matthias mentioned it in his presentation, we need to get to 68% of the electricity mix by renewables by 2030. That means we've got to be installing close to 100, and wind and solar generation has got to be increasing close to 100 terawatt hours a year by 2030. And that's almost 3 times faster than what we installed last decade. And then you add up all the national energy and climate plans, which is what we did last year, and we got, and it seems by adding them all up, you get to around about 72 terawatt hours worth of growth. So it's really nice to see those national energy climate plans really stepping up to twice the level of build that we've had. But we need to be at 3 times that level of build to be able to hit those targets. So the national energy climate plans and that kind of missing gap, as it were, is going to be a critical kind of discussion point for this year. In terms of our route through the electricity transition for this decade. If we talk about wind solar capacity additions now, this is a bit this is kind of worth talking about with a few different angles. These are numbers all from the IEA, and it's interesting to see their forecasts. These are from November, and it's interesting to see their forecasts for 2020. So for wind, they're saying broadly in line with the last few years. For solar, a bit of an increase on that number from 2019, but not reaching the record set back in 2011. But then if you look at the number for 2021, and part of that was because obviously a COVID impact, so there was a few projects delayed. If you look at the step up that we're expecting, or they're expecting in 2021, is to be setting new records for both wind and solar. And then in the next couple of years, the pipeline, from looking at the pipeline, the IEA is saying that there'll be even further growth. So definitely at the moment already, we know that there'll be this big step up, and that's happening on the ground in terms of installation, build at the moment, and investment. What we don't know is to what extent, how fast that will step up, and whether it will be fast enough to meet those targets. So that was the first half of the presentation, which was talking about rising renewables and the findings. And the second half, I want to switch into the fossil side. So we'll start with the coal side. Coal generation has almost halved in the last 5 years. This is the terawatt hours. It's split by lignite and hard coal, and it's the second year in a row that the lignite generation has shown a large fall. And a large part of that fall in lignite in 2020 was through the peak of lockdown in April and May. And what happened was gas price fell to such a low level that gas generation undercut lignite. So what happened was, especially in Germany, you saw gas generation step in, not just within Germany, but neighboring countries. Instead of Germany exporting that lignite, those neighboring countries were using a cheaper gas generation of their own to meet electricity demand. And that was the same for other countries as well. The reduction in exports, as it was exporting less lignite, which was met by gas in neighboring countries. So it was true for Poland, it was true for Romania, for Bulgaria, where they have that level of lignite generation. This is the split by country, and I guess just at the broadest level, if you look through the changes throughout the last 5 years of any country, it's been quite a half decade of transformation from a coal perspective. And that's probably, I really want to kind of sell the kind of good news aspect of how far we've come on coal so far. In total, coal is still 13% of the electricity mix. To get to that European Commission 2030 number on the impact assessment, they're saying that coal needs to be really heading towards zero by 2030. So we've got 10 years to really kind of continue this transition of phasing out coal within Europe. What we found was across Europe as a whole, coal generation fell by 20%. So you can see the differences by different countries. I guess there were some countries where in Greece, in Netherlands, which saw some coal generation continue to plummet. Spain's going down to such low levels now. the one thing I probably want to highlight from this is that Germany has been falling so rapidly. It's now close to where Poland is. So actually, during 6 months of last year, from February through to July, coal generation in Poland was actually higher than it was in Germany, and that's never happened before. So as Germany is kind of continuing through this transition, Poland is being a bit left behind and really being exposed by the amount of coal that sits within its electricity mix. So coal's been replaced by wind and solar, right? Well, obviously not quite that simple. If we take a step back over the last 5 years and see how that change has worked year on year, what we've seen is that wind and solar has increased by 176 terawatt hours. Coal's fallen by 340 terawatt hours. So half of that fall in half of the fall in coal can at the highest level be attributed to the rise in wind and solar. But gas has also been rising throughout that time as well. So the fall in coal, the rapid fall in coal, could only continue if that step, without increasing gas, if the step up in wind and solar really happens. And in terms of another point I want to pull out here to explain why COVID actually didn't have as much impact as you thought it might do on the electricity mix in 2020. There was a big fall in nuclear generation in that purple bar in 2020. And that fall in nuclear generation was a fall of 10% across the whole of Europe. There were a big fall across France, but also closing plants in Germany, in Sweden, and Belgium fell again of its nuclear generation. And actually that fall in nuclear generation actually offset a large amount of the electricity demand that fell. So if that nuclear generation hadn't been falling, then you'd have seen an even faster fall in fossil generation. It was the main reason why we didn't see so much of a fall in fossil as maybe we could have done. And also to explain why, when we're talking about that fall in fossil, that we're not attributing it to the COVID effect. So I really like this graphic. This graphic shows that kind of evolution. It's putting the coal generation on top of the wind and solar to show the evolution in different countries about how wind and solar is replacing coal. And that you can see across so many countries, whether you're talking about, let's just look at a few together, Germany or Greece or Ireland, you can see that wind and solar stepping up and it's eating into the coal generation. Which is exactly what you want. There's a few countries in there that are quite noticeable, like Poland, where that step up in wind and solar is quite small, and it's got to go so far into coal. And then kind of Czech Republic and Bulgaria, which aren't really stepping up at all at the moment. And then if you go on to the next slide, we've got the same chart. It might look a bit busy, but what we've done is we've added gas into there as well. What I want to bring across is so far the story about building wind and solar has been about displacing coal, but there's so much more to Europe's electricity transition. It's got to go into replacing coal, then it's got to go into replacing gas. At the same time, nuclear power plants are coming offline and electricity demand is stepping up as we have electrification of cars, of heating, of industry. So wind and solar have got such a major role to do in all of this, and that's why that step up needs to be so big for all those reasons. So last but one slide now, and this slide always, I think, shocks quite a lot of people. It's the electricity mix in 2020, and if we split it out just by fossil, nuclear, and renewables, and you've got Poland at the top, which I think most people would expect, but then you've got Netherlands at number 2. So although you've got the wind and solar start coming in, within Netherlands, they don't have a lot of nuclear in the mix. They don't have legacy hydro. So actually a lot of their generation at the starting point is fossil generation. So there's so much more work to do to be able to knock fossil generation out of the electricity mix. The same for Greece, same for Ireland, same for Italy. Great news stories on how quickly coal generation is dropping, but to actually get to the next stage of knocking gas out of the electricity mix, there's still huge amounts of work that needs to happen. And just the final slide to end on, this is the carbon intensity numbers for the main 19 countries in Europe. And I missed if you look at the whole 27 countries, you'll see, it's obviously not on here, but you'll see Estonia as the dirtiest. It's been the dirtiest for the last 20 years. It's been closing some of its oil shale, and what happened in 2019, in 2020, was for the first time, by closing that oil shale, its electricity and carbon intensity overtook that of Poland. So now Poland, for the first time, has got the dirtiest electricity in Europe. But really, the point of showing this graph was to show that progress towards zero. So across the last 5 years, Europe's electricity has got 30% cleaner, mostly through that through to the fall in coal, offset by a bit of the increase in gas. And the biggest falls have been happening in those cold countries. So I just want to highlight one country to end on, which is the story with Greece, where they have some really, really inefficient lignite, and that lignite generation has been falling pretty quickly. They've got a pathway to continue seeing that fall, and that's made substantial difference to Greece's carbon intensity of its electricity. That's all from my side. I just want to hand over to Fabian now to pick up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So I just want to give a quick look on the impact of COVID-19 on the electricity demand and on the whole electricity sector. So what you can see here is basically the drop on a monthly basis of the electricity demand in the EU as a whole on the top and top left, and for a variety of other countries as well. And what we can see here is that basically you have a regular part, a regular up and down, which is basically due to how warm it is, what the temperature is like, and a few other factors. And then what we can see basically in all of the countries throughout, and also for the EU 27 as a whole, is that we had a sharp decline when we had the first wave of corona restrictions and the first wave of corona infections. Overall, basically only in April in the EU 27, we had a demand drop of around 13%. And over the course of the whole year, we were more or less at -4%. So what does it actually mean? To understand that, here's a look at the marginal cost of electricity for different fossil power plants. And this basically shows why we saw what we saw over the past 2 or 3 years. So what you can see basically in red is the CO2 price, which has been increasing and more or less stable throughout the year in 2020. Right now, I think I checked the last time yesterday, we're actually at around 35, somewhere between 30 and 35 for the past few weeks. And what that did to the other kinds of fossil generation was basically that lignite and hard coal generation became a lot more expensive, and gas became slightly more expensive. But for gas, the effect of a really small gas price was actually stronger than the increase in CO2 price, as gas obviously also has a smaller CO2 emission factor. So when you look at the beginning of 2019, around January, February, you could see basically that the CO2 price increased, and we saw that gas generation became cheaper than hard coal generation. So we could see the coal to gas switch for hard coal right there, and that continued throughout the year. And then when you look at the beginning of 2020, you can see that actually gas became cheaper than lignite generation, and it stayed like that for basically the whole year. And what that means basically is that gas became cheaper, and this is also why we only saw a slight, or I think it was a 4% decrease in gas generation, while we had a strong decrease in coal generation. This because, well, in the merit order, lignite and hard coal came after gas generation. Just a quick note, what we use here obviously is average efficiencies that we display in the bottom. So this is obviously it's not true for every single power plant because of different efficiencies, etc. But this is just an overview and average. And what happened also due to the low demand basically is that we saw very small power prices across Europe, at least compared to last year's power prices. We saw cheaper electricity prices throughout Europe. We actually had Norway on a monthly basis once below 2 euros per megawatt hour, as an average below 10, which is really small. And we can also see that basically Poland still has the highest electricity prices, having a lot of coal in their electricity mix. While other countries where we don't have a lot of fossils and at the same time a lot of renewables in the system, you have quite cheap electricity prices. That being said, I think we're at the end of the presentation, and I will hand back to Nicola and Craig, and I'm looking forward to any questions and discussion. Thank you from my side. Nicola, you're still muted.
Yeah, I was just talking and explaining what I was doing. I stopped your screen sharing, and I'm happy to hand over to Craig and ask the audience. You're still obviously allowed to put in questions in the Q&A session. We've already gathered a few, and Craig will already start asking them on your behalf. But yes, continue asking whatever comes to your mind. And have a good discussion now.
Yes, good morning, everyone, or good day to those of you in different time zones. I was just typing an answer to one question, so I'll go ahead and just switch to answering that very briefly. Christoph Waldauf has asked if we shouldn't just talk about replacing gas with green gas. And I believe I posted a video just now that our CEO, Patrick Reichen, recorded this week for the Korea Green Hydrogen Forum. The answer, Christoph, from Agora's perspective is we should not think of replacing fossil gas with green gas, but we will replace fossil with electrification and gas. So don't think of it as just gas to gas, it's gas to electrification with green gas coming in certain pockets where electrification is not going to be very practical. If I switch over, we have a couple of questions, I believe, for Dave very specifically. I'll just start with this one, Dave. What is the role of nuclear power for the decarbonization in the UK, to your point of view?
I'm not sure that I particularly want to answer that. I mean, at the broadest level, it's a slight distraction. I think that the wind and solar have just proved themselves. Offshore wind, in the UK has just proved itself so much better on so many metrics, not least in the speed that is deployable, the price at which it's deployable. The biggest conversation on the next step for nuclear now is what price would that come in at, and to what extent would companies actually be interested in building at that price. There was always an expectation that when we paid for Hinkley, that was the first of many that we were kind of overpaying on purpose, with the expectation that the next one would need to be cheaper. But Hinkley is twice the price of what offshore wind was coming in at the last auction. So there's an awful lot of questions unanswered on that, and if I'm honest, it's just a slight distraction to the offshore wind program that's happening within the UK at the moment, and will deliver such big results over the next half decade and full decade.
All right, we're getting some rather fundamental questions about all kinds of things about variable renewables and things like that. So I'd like to focus really on the questions that are very specifically about this report. So Dave, there's another one here about the wind trajectories, if I can pronounce that word. There were some abbreviations there, all BNK, mix reg, C price. C price is probably carbon price. Do you know, can you tell us what mix reg and all BNK means?
It's just different different scenarios that the Commission have within their modelling to be able to get through. So they have a base case scenario, and then they have 4 or 5 different scenarios underneath that of how you building up policy in different ways and technology in different ways. I'm not able to go into the detail. I'm sure Matthias could be more better than me, but it does make an interesting read when you go through that in a bit more detail to understand what the Commission are thinking about getting to that target.
Okay. And just as long as we're with you, Dave, leave your mic on. One last question for you. You outlined the potential for wind to displace gas in the UK. How do you see a similar theme playing out in Germany? Obviously, a more complicated proposition in Germany politically, but do you see gas being displaced?
Yeah, ultimately it's got to. Right? The aim is reduce the emissions of the electricity sector down to zero. So that's definitely going to happen. It's a question of how quickly it will be. Within Germany, Germany's got a lot more challenges in the fact that it's got so much more coal to get through first. At the same time as nuclear power plants are coming offline, and then underlying all of that, the increase in electricity demand. So sure, it's got to do that. It's a long way off getting to that point.
Okay. Just a brief reminder to everyone, we have a chat room and an F&A, a Q&A room. Please don't put the questions into the chat. It's really just because I can't see all these windows at once. Okay, so put it into the Q&A. We have a question about variable renewables. Maybe I can ask Matthias Buck, how should the volatility of renewables be handled? And maybe I should reword that, because the volatility of renewables is really primarily wind and solar, okay? Less so hydropower, less so bioenergy for electricity. The questioner asks, is it building storage? Is it hydrogen, lithium, pump power plants, throwing off load? Matthias, what do we say to that?
I think it depends. So we know that if you're increasing the share of variable renewables in the electricity mix, at the same time, you need to expand the flexibility options that you have in your energy system. This can be on the supply side as well as on the demand side. And it very much depends. So there's a list of flexibilities that we do know about, which are economically interesting to explore, but it really depends on the specific country and the specific region, what mix of flexibility options is the best. Perhaps a word there from the EU regulatory side. I think we've gone in a major step with the electricity market regulation that is obliging the member states to do some planning ahead for the flexibility in their power system, while also harmonizing the assessments of power system adequacy to what extent overall the power system is reliable, and to really do the planning ahead for that purpose in order to cope with the rising share of volatile renewables in the mix. So you cannot give a one answer, but really it depends on this situation, but they're well-known and tested options for increasing the flexibility in the power system.
Martin Ahlert has a question here. He's a bit concerned about just us presenting the terawatt hours per year. He says what's really interesting for him is the capacity of renewables at 15-minute values, right? Because of the fluctuations go up and down. This is much more interesting for industrial customers, he writes. So maybe he's from an industrial firm. We fear the lag of secured power generation, right? What do we say to that? Who wants to take that?
Matthias might want to chip in. I mean, I'd be interested to see where there have been examples of reduced quality of stable power so far. There was obviously the incident in December where the European grid split into half, which was caused by an old transformer going out in Croatia, which knocked a transformer out in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina next door. And then resulted in that cascade, but that wasn't attributable to wind and solar in any way, at least in what ENSOE have said so far. And I haven't seen any other examples of how that's impacted the quality of electricity from a customer perspective. The one thing that I guess really excites me about the European electricity transition is just all the kind of innovation coming along. And one part of the innovation that's doing really was just how to cope, like different ways to be able to provide into the system operators ways to manage the frequency on a so like a lot of the time we're talking about the hourly windows or the daily windows of renewables coming up and down, but that also applies on a second and a millisecond basis as well. And there's so much new tech coming in about how to offer services to the system operators around that and cope with that is really quite encouraging. So maybe like 5 years ago, we were kind of sitting there going, not sure that we've got the answers for quite all of this. But if the rate of innovation carries on in the way that it's been developed in the last few years, certainly on the quality of electricity, I don't see an issue there.
All right. Another question, Sanjeev Kumar has asked about an increase in electricity consumption driven by heat electrification. Now, of course, we saw with the COVID numbers that demand went down, and maybe we're not there yet for electricity increasing from heat. So maybe we could take the question a bit bigger, not only what's going on right now, but what is the outlook for increased electricity demand from heat electrification?
So what I guess if I could add something in, and if anyone else wants to chip in, from my side, the changes in electricity demand were so wild last year. It was like it's impossible to ascertain any kind of trends for anything underneath the massive swings that happen with COVID. I'd love to see what the impact of working from home is doing to total electricity demand by piece. I haven't really seen any decent write-up of that. If anyone wants to share anything in the chat, I'd be it might be really useful to people on this call. Just on the electrification of heat, I guess the one thing that I really wanted to point out was when the electricity mix within Europe was so much more coal in it, it really didn't make that much more sense. When we're now talking about heat pumps and we've got that route towards zero carbon electricity that we can see is now yielding results. That's a really compelling argument to actually do what we know we need to do, which is start rolling out heat pumps across Europe to be able to decarbonize gas-based heating.
Right. So really, when we say electrification, it really matters whether we're talking about heat pumps or something else. Fabian, would you like to comment?
Sure. Maybe just a quick addition. So last year we published a study where we looked at the climate neutral Germany in 2050 and how we could get there in some kind of an efficient manner. And what we found is that basically electrification is quite a substantial part of that. And this is also why up until now, it has not been really looked at too much into detail, or it has to be actually considered far more than it has been in the past, especially from governments, because we see, obviously, the more electricity we have, we also have more need for renewable energies. And basically, this is what triggers a substantial part of this additional electricity amount from renewables that we can see in the next decade and beyond.
All right, let me just, I've received a request for a link to the video, so I'm going to put this in the chat. Did that go out correctly? Hope so. All right. So we had another question, I believe, about specifically how we will, if we're reducing natural gas going forwards, how will we prevent blackouts when there is very little sun and wind? If you're going to reduce fossil gas. Fabian?
I think Matthias has already addressed this to an extent before. I mean, obviously, we have to talk about different things here. For example, I can only speak for right here for Germany, but what we've seen in the past years is that for the really quick responses to any need in the grid, so the primary control reserve, basically what we've seen is that the largest share of that is actually fulfilled by batteries. It's not anything conventional power plants or anything like that, but it is batteries. And then, of course, so this is one part on the really millisecond base. And then what Matthias already mentioned before is that flexibility options will be much more important in the future that we see. And then third, obviously, we also have what you can also, Craig, maybe you can post also the link for the Climate Neutral Germany study in the chat, where we actually looked at this in more detail, although it's only for Germany. But what we see also is obviously that we still have a certain need for, in that sense, conventional, that we see some gas power plants that are being driven with hydrogen, actually. Dave, you want to add something? And
I guess the way that I see this is when you kind of see the transition building up, it's a stepwise approach. So every year you kind of go one step further and one step further. So the ultimate, like, that you're worried about in your head is like, how do you get renewables to fill the gap without, like, when there's no wind, when wind and sun when there's not a lot of wind and sun. But when you look at that journey going up, like, you look at it on an hour-by-hour basis, you're knocking more and more gas out of the mix. And then you get to the next stage of that journey where in some hours you get too much wind and solar relative to what you need to meet electricity. And that's where storage, that's where electrolyzers for hydrogen come in. And then you can keep building up from that. So there is a concern about what that endpoint looks like, but really the journey we're on at the moment, we're a long way off that journey in most countries, and we've got time to be able to build through that. And some of the innovation that's happening, talking about long-term energy storage, is really encouraging. And sure, there's questions that perhaps we haven't got answers to in all of this, but the rate of innovation kind of gives you hope that by the time we do get there, we will have those answers.
Matthias?
No,
you had your microphone on, so I thought you.
No, I saw it coming in, but I think I'm happy with the replies.
Okay, and I now have the correct link to the video in the chat. I just noticed that I had posted something else there. All right, we have a question from Andre Langbost, a fellow Freiburger, by the way. Hello, Andre. He now works for ESMC, European Solar, and he wants to know what we think about production in Europe, a 15 gigawatt solar production factory. So a slightly off-topic question, but what do we think about production capacities within the EU? Matthias?
I know there's some talk about it in Brussels, that we should kind of gain back the competence of building cheap solar also in Europe. So not only importing it. And it's part of the large investment planning of some governments in where they want to invest some of the recovery money into. What I hear is that if you talk about a very high level of automation, and if some of the resources needed for building solar PV panels can also be found in Europe, which is also an effort now, that it might be cost competitive. I think it really boils down to that question. Is it cost competitive if it is produced in Europe? Yes or no? In the past, we've lost that competitiveness to other countries, mostly to China. Question, can we do it, kind of regain that competitiveness? Question is open in my mind.
I think that the answer that, like, globally, like, it's clear that solar has just come to that price point where there's going to be massive deployment across the world, and total global capacity needs to step up more generally. It'd be awesome if that happens in Europe. But it's not like this is going to replace capacity anywhere else across the rest of the world. There needs to be that massive step up in the new generation of solar cells to be able to meet that demand for solar, which is going to be so huge.
Okay, I believe the next question would probably be best for Fabian because it's a bit COVID related. The energy mix in 2020 was affected by the lockdowns. What is your outlook for 2021? Maybe I could also change the question a little bit, because we could just say post-pandemic. We don't really know when all of this is going to ramp up again. So if it's 2021, fine, but probably 2022. What's going to happen?
So, I mean, we already saw that electricity demand basically rebounded or experienced a rebound and is already back, or was already back sometime September, October around last year, back to pre-pandemic levels, so to say. So it is already back there. And obviously last year, this minus 4% helped in a way to have a higher share of renewables to an extent. Although, as Dave explained before, this is obviously not the dominant part. And basically it only shows, once again, we have an increase in electricity demand that we will also have just from electrification, for example. And this just shows the need for an increase in solar and wind installations. Dave, you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it. And the only, like a large part of you remember that piece about nuclear falling down as demand fell down. So part of the question as demand returns again, what's nuclear in that role? If nuclear still continues with problems through this year, then there might be a small bounce back up in fossil generation, but it's going to be a very small, short-lived kick up. I think the interesting thing for me is really what happens with the lignite generation now, because part of that story that happened last year was when gas came cheaper than lignite for a few months, and whether that might happen in the future. And if you're looking at what's happening on the carbon market today with another new record being set at 38 euros, and you're like a lignite generator, the gas market went a bit crazy a few weeks ago. It's taken a chill pill since then. So you're at a level now where gas and lignite are going to compete very, very equally, and that's really is going to be really interesting to see how that lignite gas plays out throughout this year.
All right, we still have time for questions. So if you have any, please go to the Q&A down at the bottom, because I think we have handled a large number of the questions, at least. I'm getting a number of comments about nuclear, but I have the feeling that the panel doesn't want this to be such a nuclear versus renewables discussion. So I'm going to actually focus on a couple of other issues that are more pertinent for the work that we've just produced. Terry Werner has asked about the price levels for solar and wind on slide 24. Nicola wants to answer this, it looks like.
Not really. I just wanted to make it visible to the audience. So
okay.
The panel, go ahead, answer if you feel like it.
Yeah, so I'm not actually sure which slide 24 that was. So Dave or Fabian, do you know which slide we are referring to?
I don't have any data on the cost side as an update. We have put that in before about the increase in costs, so I can't say anything on that specifically about what happened on the journey in Europe on wind and solar costs. Is there anything, Matthias or Fabian or Craig, that you want to say on that from your own?
Yeah, maybe really quick. So, I mean, it's always difficult to talk about marginal cost when it comes to renewables. But what we're seeing basically is that for both wind and solar, we have auctions that are below 10 euros per megawatt hour. So obviously, this is the cheapest source of electricity, although we've seen sort of problems with the German auction system, the way it works right now, as we have, or some of the auctions that, at least for wind onshore, are short. So we have actually quite high prices compared to what would be possible if we had strong competition going on there. But nevertheless, we are still below 10 euros per megawatt hour. Matthias, you want to add something?
No, not really. I mean, of course, the focus here is on the operating costs and not on the, let's say, investment into the infrastructure, which is what the auctions are kind of giving as a result. But of course, at the wholesale electricity markets, renewables can normally undercut other technologies that do have operating costs. because they are much lower of renewables.
And sorry, I have to correct myself. It was obviously 10 cents per kilowatt hour, not euros per megawatt hour that I was talking about. But this is only for the auctions, and obviously for this one here, the operational costs would be the ones to look at.
All right. I would actually, and Fabian, if you can turn off the screen sharing, thank you. I would actually like just to post something and read something that Martin Ahlet said. We had 3 short-term interruptions in the last 4 years caused by problems in the two 2380 kilovolt transport systems. Cost us nearly 100 million euros as our industrial park had to stop operations, go into secure system status. It takes us more than 4 to 8 weeks to go back to normal ops. Again, whether renewables is the culprit there, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But what I think is interesting about that comment is that we responded to Martin's original question by saying, you know, blackouts at the global level, but actually there are interruptions that can happen at a very local level. And so as we talk about VRE going forward, we really need to not just say the system as a whole has been good, but really how have individual industrial parks been affected. So
maybe just sorry, Craig, maybe just a quick addition. I mean, obviously this security of supply, especially for industry, is a really major part, but what we're also seeing is that more and more companies from industry actually are asking for more renewables because they know that this will secure cheap electricity prices. So this is sort of also one aspect from industry that is coming up more and more.
All right. Tony Vidan of Croatia asks, do you see a benefit in local decentralized ownership of new renewables? And should the EU proactively implement policies in favor of such ownership?
Perhaps I take it. I mean, Tony, if you recall the basic message, we need to almost triple the annual increase of wind and solar over the next decade compared to the last decade. So in that sense, it means all hands on deck, utility scale, but also increasing decentralized renewables installations. And in that sense, what I hope will be happening is that all member states will be implementing thoroughly what is laid out in the Renewable Energy Directive, the last revised version that is now being implemented, where you have specific provisions on renewable energy communities and on the ability of individuals and collectives to become owners of renewable energy installations.
All right, we have 2 questions that are very similar about imports and exports from Jacopo and Jan Dietrich, Jacopo Giola. So did the report consider the influence of imports and exports on national demand data? And are the numbers produced in the study, is it production or is it consumption? Do you consider trading between countries? And do you consider trading from EU 27 outside? So
can we, is it possible, Nicola or Fabian, I forget who's got the magic button now, just to pull up slide 28. There's a...
I'll look for it. Just give me a second.
We've got a couple of appendix slides. By the way, we have lots of a whole slide graveyard of slides that we never even put into the report. So in the answer to Sanjiv's question, he had one about whether we can split out fossil by coal and gas. I'll forward that on. That's one of the ones that we built and sits in the little graph graveyard. But this is we kind of skipped over this because we wanted to keep a bit high level, but it's a really good question around the import. So this, and I can go into the monthly level, but it's nice to view this at an annual level. So this is what the change on change in 2020 in terawatt hours. If I just explain a little bit so you can see what's going on, and I'll isolate France in this just so we can talk through an example together. The red dot is the change in demand. So there's been a big fall in demand of about 25 terawatt hours. the fall in nuclear was even bigger than that within France. So it's close to 48 terawatt hours worth of fall with, 45 terawatt hours of fall in nuclear. And what happened with that was there was an increase, reduction in exports, or an increase in net imports on this graph to counter. So you can see from this graph some of the changes that have happened across different EU27 countries there. So within, that was a story within France. The other one that saw a big change in import export was on Germany, where Germany had been having record exports year on year, and that eased somewhat in 2020, where it exported less electricity because coal and specifically lignite generation fell to a level below gas, where other countries were generating some of that electricity themselves instead of importing it from Germany. If you look across the whole of the EU27, the interconnection across the whole EU27 is not that big. The biggest connection is across to UK. There's some countries down the side through Ukraine into the Western Balkans and then across to Morocco. All those links don't add up to too much. So in total, when we look at all of these numbers year on year at a European level, the net imports is fairly unchanged. And you asked the question about why is this a percentage of production or percentage of consumption in all of this? All of when we in the slides that you've seen where we talk about percentage, it's always a percentage of production. Otherwise, you end up having 110% of generation from consumption, where you get net imports, which makes it very confusing. To simplify things, we always express it in terms of percentage of electricity production. So I hope that kind of unwound a few of the questions that we talked about there.
All right. Kirsten Kleis has a question about slide 20, if you want to pull that up. Basically, the percentage of total electricity generation is given, but she's wondering, it looks like wind, solar, coal, and gas do not add up to 100%, and then nuclear can't close the gap or something. So maybe we can clarify what we're looking at there. Can we find that slide? Okay.
Yeah, so the idea of this slide, you're right. There's also other renewables on top. So we're missing bioenergy in there, and we're missing hydro, which is huge in a lot of countries. Hence the kind of that total gap is quite big when you're looking at wind, solar, coal, and gas. The purpose of this slide really was to show, as that wind and solar is building up, how much to coal and gas they offset. When you add all those different fuels up, yes, they add up to 100% for all the countries. I'd love to talk through this slide and have another hour talking through this slide, because it's really interesting looking across different countries, but I hope that gives a bit more of a way to explain it and pitch it.
All right. Any other questions coming in? Hope I am covering everything. We have a question from Japan, from Rio Nishida. The wider grid is better when we think about grid frequency control. The European grid is larger than the Japanese one. And of course, actually the Japanese grid has, I believe it's 2 frequencies or something, so it's kind of 2 grids. Do you have any kind of issues or problems on your grid in Europe because it is so large?
Take that one? Yeah, go ahead.
I think the answer is always going to be that a bigger grid is going to be easier, because it can absorb more fluctuations into it like a sponge, and you've got more capability to deal with that. So I would say that's easier rather than smaller. I mean, there's still isolated problems underneath that, like geographically. So, for example, the UK isn't synchronized. Is Turkey now synchronized? It wasn't initially. It hadn't been synchronized. I know there's a plan to do it. So there's kind of different parts of that about how much is synchronized to the main European grid, and then I was really interested in talking about the industrial interruptions that happened with Martin, and I wasn't sure whether they were caused by medium voltage changes as opposed to the total grid voltage, because underneath that, obviously, there's a lot of work going on by DSOs, by the distributed system operators, about how to control fluctuations at a more local level that don't immediately feed off and match up with the grid frequency.
Correct. On the European grid, so at Agora, we have done a number of studies where we show also in quantitative terms what we call the smoothing effects of enlarging the grid when it comes to coping with the volatility of wind and solar. At the same time, I think the challenge for Europe is a different one than in Japan, probably, because the electricity system in Europe has been built around national systems, and it is still growing together. Very practically in physical terms, we have interconnection between the different grids in Europe, but the interconnection level as such is still expanding. And of course, expansion means there is more interaction and there needs to be more collaborative management of the power flowing through the grid. And this is still in evolution in Europe. So our challenge in making full use of the potential of the European power system to absorb increasing levels of volatile renewables is still growing. We are still moving into making full use of the potential that we have.
All right. This is not so much a question, but a comment that I'd like to read to you from Karina Tillman. Going back to what Fabian said, a little bit of pushback. Sorry, but industry is not asking for renewable energy because it's cheaper, but because our customers are asking for green products, but they're not willing to pay more for it. So I'll just let that sit there, unless somebody wants to comment on it. But Agora, incidentally, is Greek for marketplace, but it's a marketplace of ideas. So thank you, Karina, for taking us out of our bubble there for a moment. I'm happy to field comments as well, critical comments. Ariane Bastani wants to know if TSOs have increased network stabilization measures and why. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. I'm pretty sure the reason why is variable renewables, but does anybody know more? Fabian, you look a bit skeptical, no? No answer? Okay, that was a no that you don't want to field the question. Anybody want to field the question? Okay, we don't have a grid expert on the panel here. Again, we're focusing more on the study, which doesn't really go into that. So again, we still have some more time. Feel free to post questions or critical comments in the questions area. I'm mainly trying to make sure I have a number of comments from the same people, so I'm trying to make sure I get everyone's voice in here. Okay, I believe I've handled everyone. We have some multiple questions from a few people, but I'd like to spread it around. So maybe I'll ask Nicola. Nicola, how are you feeling?
Well, looking at the time and considering that we've been discussing the Q&As, we may step over into the finishing advertising part and offer participants that if they still have something which they would like to let us know or ask us. They can, of course, always send us an email on webinar@agora-energiewende.de. I will make sure that someone on the podium, on the panel, receives it, and we can still answer open questions. And I'm going to post one more time several things into the chat so that you're all prepared with a link to the report, with the link to the presentation, which was shown by Matthias, Fabian, Grace, and Dave. And before I forget, thank you very much to the panel for being here with us and presenting all those graphs and all the insights that you got from preparing that report. And thank you for Craig for moderating the Q&A session. And for the audience for participating and asking questions and staying with us till now. If you're interested in the recording, I'm sure it will be on our website at some stage till the end of the week. And we usually inform you about new products on our website via the newsletter. And I did post the link to register for our newsletter also into the chat. So if you would like to be kept up to date on upcoming publications or events, etc., register for it and you don't have to worry. And also, I would like to inform you about an upcoming online event, which is scheduled for next week, Thursday, 11th of February. We somehow chose the Thursday for our webinar. So, why don't you just keep that slot free throughout the year? Next week, it's going to be about hydrogen. And I saw a few questions on hydrogen, so you may be interested. The title is No Regret Hydrogen, Charting Early Steps for the H2 Infrastructure in Europe. And we're going to start at 11 o'clock. We will introduce a report that we are conducting together with AFRI. And of course, you can find everything on the website and register for it. Maybe Craig, do you see the opportunity to put that into the chat also, the link to the webinar? If you
while you were speaking, I put it in.
Fantastic. And as always, if you're unsure about a link, just visit the events section of our website and you can see all upcoming events listed there. And with that, looking at the time, 11:29, I'm happy to let the audience go into their well-deserved lunch break, and the participants from Japan and Brazil, where it must be, Brazil must be very early in the morning and Japan is almost evening. So whatever your plans are, have a good rest of the day or a good start into the day, and we hope to see you soon. We'll be sitting a few more seconds on the panel so that the audience can stroll out of the room as they wish. Bye.